Welcome back. So I took a week off last week because I've been working on a new series of videos for the channel. It's not going to be a reader's guide, but instead it's going to be a series of tags. The tag videos that I'm going to be doing are called the alphabet tags, and this was inspired by a series that someone else has done, a booktuber called Jim's Books, and I'll leave a link in the description to his channel, where basically he takes a letter of the alphabet, attaches 8 questions to that letter, and then answers those questions. And that's what I'm going to be doing in my series, and sometimes I'll be using the exact questions from his series, but sometimes I'll be adding them as well. I'm going to do 10 questions instead of 8, just because there are sometimes things that I might want to talk about that I can add in. So I'll be kicking off today with the A tag. A is for ... Finish this word with your favourite A named author. I'm going to be going last names on this, because I think usually that's what authors get referred to by, their last names. So that's how I'm going to be doing this. And for me, that is going to be Jane Austen. According to my Goodreads, I haven't actually read that many A-named authors, so it wasn't much of a competition for Jane Austen, although I would still think she's definitely up there with some of the best writers that I've read. So at the moment, I've actually only read Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, which isn't even one of her better-known books, but I think that that book is just fantastically written. The way that she satirises Gothic literature, for someone who really loves Gothic literature, is great. It's very incisive. It's clear that she's read and enjoyed these books, and that's why she's so effective at taking the mick out of them. But also her style is just wonderful. It's engaging, it's funny, it's witty, it's sharp. So yeah, I think she's a fantastic writer, and I'm looking forward to reading more of her books very soon. A is for America. Which book do you consider to be the great American novel? Well, I guess there are 2 ways that you might answer that question. One would be to think, who is the greatest American writer? And then the other way to answer that would be, which book do you think kind of captures the essence of America? And I think I'm going to go for the second answer. If I was going to go with the first answer, then I would probably have said Moby Dick. But when I read that, I didn't really get the feeling that it was a particularly American novel. Maybe you disagree. If you do, let me know why you think it is in the comments, but I certainly didn't view it that way. So thinking about the question in this other way, I think I would want to say probably Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. I think I remember vividly reading that story, and it really did kind of conjure up America for me. Another one would be The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. Again, it's just a book that really, to me anyway, as an outsider, captures the essence of what I think about when I think of America and the kind of American values. If I was to cheat though slightly, I am actually reading Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, which is a poetry collection, so it's not really a novel. But if there was anything that really captured the essence of America, it is that collection of poems. He captures the kind of liberal spirit of America, the values of equality and diversity, and kind of championing the everyday person rather than, the nobility. All that kind of stuff is all there in Whitman's poems. And so if I was to really, interpret novel to just mean work of literature, I probably would say Leaves of Grass. A is for Ark. Which character do you think has the most interesting character arc? And that's a very difficult question, just because there are so many wonderful books out there, and at the end of the day, no one of them is going to kind of be the ultimate, defeater of all of the character arcs. So, you could go with your Shakespeare's kind of Hamlet. I guess he has a very good arc. But I'm going to go with something that I read very recently, because I think that's just something I can talk about a bit better, because I recently read it. And that is Harry Hole in Hermann Hesse's book, Steppenwolf. This is a great book, and I'm going to be reviewing it next week on the channel actually. Harry Hole goes through a wonderful psychological journey in that story. At the start of the story, he sees himself in this kind of fragmented way, where he has these 2 sides to his personality, a kind of wolfish, primitive side, and then a kind of idealistic and rational side. And this causes him a lot of mental strife, and through the story he has to learn to kind of let go of that way of dividing himself and embrace the fact that he actually has a lot more inside of him, a lot more personalities than just these 2 things. I really enjoyed Steppenwolf, and I'm looking forward to talking about it. And if you want a story that has a very satisfying character arc, then you should definitely read that book. One great thing about it as well is that a lot of books, if they're going through this psychological journey, they might end in a very final sort of resolved way. But that doesn't really happen in this book. Harry certainly makes progress in the story, but at the end of the story, he's still got a lot, long ways to go. And so I enjoyed that. It was a very realistic character arc. Another book that would come to mind that I read recently would be Harriet's character arc in Donna Tartt's The Little Friend. And what I like about Harriet's character, again, is she begins as someone who is, like most kids, she sees herself as this kind of immortal being who can win all the fights she gets into. She's really smart, or she thinks she is, and she thinks she can solve her brother's murder. And through the course of the story, she starts to realize that no, she is mortal, she's going to grow up, her body's going to change, and that she's not this kind of whiz kid that she thinks she is. I think that's a very nice way of telling that coming of age story, kind of a child realizing that, you know, they're not going to live forever. They're not kind of the protagonist in a story. They're just another person in life. And so these two are the ones that I think stand out to me at the moment. A is for AntiHero. Who is your favorite anti-hero? Well, that's definitely going to be, for me, Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights is one of my favorite stories. Heathcliff is one of my favorite characters. And also I think, outside of just my bias there, Heathcliff is probably one of the archetypal anti-heroes. He's basically the epitome of the tall, dark, handsome stranger, and, you know, it doesn't really get much better than that. A is for adventure. What is one of your favourite adventure novels? I guess adventure would include lots of fantasy novels, and I guess there are going to be two answers to this, maybe one that's more recent and one that's more nostalgic. So the nostalgic one would be The Voyage of the Dawn Treader by C.S. Lewis, which is one of the books in the Chronicles of Narnia series. I always enjoyed that one. It's still one of my favourites of that series. I like the way that the kids are being taken out of Narnia. They're going to all these different places, seeing lots of different people, different cultures. And also it does get into a little bit kind of the struggles of voyaging on a ship, but not too much because it's Lewis and it's quite short and definitely a kid's book, so we're not going to go into the, you know, miserable details of being on a ship. But I did always enjoy it as a kid. I think as a kind of children's adventure story, it's one of the best that I've ever read. Thinking about a more recent series of fantasy books that I enjoyed that involve adventure, I would go with the first book in the Wheel of Time series. I think Jordan does a really good job in that first book of showing the kind of hardships of travel and adventuring. When we meet the Emansfield kids, they're all, to varying degrees, interested to go on this adventure. They're kind of looking forward to it. They think it's going to be exciting and that they're going to go down in history in these stories. And then they actually get into the nitty-gritties of traveling. It's uncomfortable, you know, your thighs hurt from riding on horses all the time, you're sleeping on the ground, not very comfortable, you get irritated with each other, and, you know, it's not very nice. In fact, the only nice bit's when you get to a city and you can actually go lie down in a proper bed. So I think that for a more realistic depiction of adventure, I really enjoyed The Wheel of Time, especially in the early books when they're more kind of adventuring around, whereas in the later books they're kind of usually rooted to cities and then just use magic to jump and hop around. A is for Australia. What was the last book you read by an Australian? Well, actually it's been quite a while, because and according to my Goodreads, I've never read a book by an Australian, and I also don't really pay attention to where people are from, unless it's a classic book where usually you just know where the author is from. I really don't pay attention to where people are from, and so it took me a while to get thinking about this, but I think probably the last book by an Australian that I read was not a fiction book, but a philosophy book by J.L. Mackie, who is a moral philosopher, and the book of his that I read was called Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong. Essentially, this is a book that's skeptical about moral realism, which, for those of you who don't do philosophy, is just the view that there are moral truths out there that are objective. So when I say it's wrong to kill, I'm saying something true. It actually is wrong to kill. And Mackie is skeptical of, you know, the idea that there are such moral truths. And in this book, he basically presents various arguments against this moral realist position. It's a really interesting book. If you're interested in ethics and those kinds of questions, it's definitely worth a read. I certainly enjoyed it, and it's always good to teach it at universities because it usually gets a lot of interesting discussions with the students. A is for automobile. What is one of your favourite literary automobiles? Now, off the top of my head, I can't really think of any at first, but then I remembered Harry Potter, the Flying Car, is probably quite a good one. I always liked the way that it kind of becomes wild and primitive and just kind of lives in the forest. I always thought that was quite funny. But aside from that, I can't really think of much, so I'm going to go with the automobile from Harry Potter. A is for anonymous. What is your favourite book that was published anonymously? Well, for me, that's going to have to be Juliet by the Marquis de Sade, because it's probably a book, you know, of all the books in the world that have been published anonymously, it's probably the only book that actually had to be published anonymously because of what's in it. So as anonymous books goes, you know, it kind of deserves that accolade, or it's not really an accolade, but I can certainly see why that's not something you would want to publish under your own name. Juliet is, to me, is just a fascinating story. It's got interesting philosophy in there, even if sometimes he goes on a little bit too much into ranty territory. It's also just got a very interesting story about sexuality there, especially female sexuality, which gets represented in a way that, you know, you don't really see in literature all that often, especially not of that time period. So it's just an amazing work, even if it's sometimes very disgusting and quite hard to get through. But I certainly enjoyed reading it, although I don't think I'll be reading it again anytime soon, at least not back to front, because that was certainly a task. A is for articulation. Which authors have the best ways with words? Well, for me, I think there are two different answers to this, because they have a way with words in a very different way, but despite the fact they have ways with words in different ways, they actually do the same thing. So firstly, we're going to have Angela Carter, who has a very rich, dense style. Some would call it purple prose, and you know, it is purple prose, but she's the kind of writer who can use purple prose very effectively. And despite the fact that she has a very elaborate style of language, there's lots of symbolism, lots of adjectives, metaphors, and it's just very dense and rich. Somehow it all manages to be very concise and sharp and witty. Usually when you think of people with purple prose, you think, oh, this is going to be so boring to read and it's just going on and on and on and on and on. But I never felt like that with Carter. Even though she uses very big, archaic words, she always uses them properly. You can really tell that she thought about using that particular word at that particular moment. And so even though it's quite elaborate, it's still quite sharp and incisive. And so I'm always really impressed by that, because, you know, there's a tendency with that kind of writing style to just bloat and bore, and she manages to make me laugh constantly with the way that she uses words. On the other end of the spectrum there, though, I'm going to say Ernest Hemingway, who has a much blunter, direct and simple writing style, which to me is equally impressive, because, you know, it's quite hard really. I mean, as someone who writes, I have a tendency to overwrite, and it's really hard sometimes to just kind of look at a sentence and can make it really concise and not add all these words in. And so the fact that he can do that and do it so effectively and not sacrifice imagery or symbolism is really impressive as well. You've got both sides of the coin there. You've got elaborate purple prose done really well and simple basic writing done really well. And the last question is, A is for audiobooks. Do you consider audiobooks to be reading? Well, as people will know, because I usually in my discussions of books will say whether I read it or listened to it, I do listen to audiobooks, and I do think it is a valid form of listening or reading material. Although I would say that it is definitely different from reading a book. Usually I would say that if I'm listening to an audiobook, it's usually because I've already read the book once, or because it's a book that I don't think I'm going to be talking about on the channel in any kind of depth. Because I think that when you listen to an audiobook, or at least when I listen to them, I'm not listening to them, just sat there. I'm listening to them in the shower or when I'm cooking, so I'm not focusing as much as I would be than if I was reading the text. And so I think certainly if you're listening to an audiobook, you do to some extent lose a certain amount of detail. So if I'm going to talk about a book in depth on the channel, I will sit down and read it so I can make notes, so I can give it my full focus. Also, I think, when you're listening to an audiobook, you are getting someone else's interpretation of the story. They interpret the characters and convey that through voices, and that can then affect the way that you relate to the story. I remember with Lolita, for example, when I first listened to an audiobook, and because of the narration, I found the character to be quite unsympathetic and missed a lot of the humour. And then when I read the book, I was actually able to see the humour of the story a lot more. So there is definitely an issue there with an audiobook. That being said, I wouldn't want to say that if you've not read it like this, then you haven't read the book. That seems to me to be a bit ridiculous. It's just that there are differences in both approaches. And one thing that I think actually is better when it comes to audiobooks, and not reading in your head anyway, is that it allows you to appreciate the way that authors put words together a lot more. This is true especially if you're listening to poetry, but even just normal writing. When you hear the way the sentence is put together and you're really paying attention, you can really appreciate the sound of the words. And stories essentially, they are meant to be told, and you tell stories, or traditionally told them through speaking. So I think you actually do get something there from an audiobook, because you get to hear how those words sound. And if you've got a good writer who thinks about that, they actually read the story out loud to themselves, for example, when they're editing, that really comes across in an audiobook. And you can kind of tell the difference between a writer, I guess, who's got more of an ear for the writing style than a writer who's just kind of focusing, I guess, more on the internal way that you put words together. And I guess one more thing to add to there is, do I prefer one or the other? I think I definitely prefer reading books in this proper way, just because at the end of the day, it's much more personal to sit down with a book. It's much more personal to give it your own time. And if you really want to understand a book and get into it, I think you do have to, you know, give it as much focus as you can. And that's easier to do if you're sitting down and reading it than if you're listening to an audiobook. But you know, I guess more auditory people might actually find audiobooks to be something they can concentrate on a lot more. So maybe for some people that doesn't hold true. All right, that is it for this tag. Let me know what you think or how you'd answer some of these questions, especially the question on audiobooks. Let me know what you think about them. Do you think that they count as reading or not? I look forward to discussing these questions with you in the comments, and I will see you all next week on the next tag where we look at the letter B.